Hello once again. Welcome for another news roundup of what's going on here in the Middle East. It is the 6th. Is it really it's the 6th of May 2025? My goodness. And so what's happening here in northern Israel and in Israel in general, and with what's happening with the conflicts that Israel is involved with at the moment? Well, it's been reported that overnight some 20 Israeli fighter jets were sent to Yemen, and there they blew out several targets at Hodeidah port and a number of other key targets. That's what's been reported so far. And we've seen the Yemeni Houthis, or the Houthis in Yemen, releasing footage of the various attacks, or rather the after effects of the attacks. You can see the port on fire, and et cetera, et cetera. It's been spreading around like wildfire, so to speak, on social media. And apparently there's also been a large explosion in Tehran, or I'm sorry, in Iran. I don't think it was actually in Tehran. Maybe it was, but it was somewhere in Tehran, and it was an underground explosion that apparently took out a significantly sized ammunition warehouse. You have to remember that, among other things that Iran has and does, it is a very large producer of weapons. Right? It sells weapons to many countries around the world, and it's one of its actual important revenue streams as a country. So when they lose significant chunks of their ammo, it's a hit to them economically as well as obviously militarily, in case they were to use that ammo for themselves. It's also been reported that they've unveiled a new kind of air defense system that can shoot things down up to 150 kilometers. We'll see if that poses a significant threat or not to any potential threat that they might face. For now, Israel is also involved in continuing to help the people in Suwaida, which is in southern Syria. It is a Druze city or village or whatever, town in southern Syria, where many thousands of Druze live. You have to remember that there are hundreds of thousands. It might be almost like 750,000 or something like that, or 800,000. It's a not insignificant number of Druze that live in Syria. Far more than actually live in Israel. Right? In Israel, we do have a couple 100,000, which is not a tiny number either. But they have many more in Syria, and they have a fairly sizable community also in Lebanon. But by far, Syria is a noticeable chunk of their population, and they've been under attack, honestly, for a long time, but really pretty much since the beginning of this new HTS regime that has come into power, temporarily at least. Probably not going to be so temporary in Syria, right? And the HTS terrorists, which at the outset of their reign, their reign of terror, literally, their leader, Mr. Gulani or whatever he called himself back then, now Mr. Shara, he calls himself, since he switched from his kind of combat fatigue style of dress to wearing suits. He calls himself Mr. Shara, whatever. He has said that they wouldn't tolerate any attacks on minorities in Syria, and yet his very forces have been attacking minorities across pretty much all of Syria since pretty much the time they took power. Now, were there a few days in the beginning when people were hoping that that might be real? Yeah, it lasted, oh, I don't know, a few hours, maybe a few days, maybe a week, but very, very soon. I mean, pretty much immediately. Yeah, like literally within the first days, there were already reports of attacks on ethnic minorities, and of course against Alawites who had been part of the former Assad regime. And you got to remember that many of those people, yes, they did live obviously a more comfortable life than their non-Alawite, compatriots, and that's just the way that it works when you're a dictatorship. If you're part of the ruling class, whether you like it or not, you're going to have a quote-unquote more comfortable life. And if you're not part of the ruling class, whether you like it or not, you're going to have a more difficult life. And it's like, yes, I'm sure the Alawites were happy to have a relatively more comfortable life, but I'm sure not all of them were happy about the fact that their fellow compatriots who just happened to not be born Alawite were living a much more difficult life. And so you got to remember, not like as bad as the Assad regime was, and it was horrifically bad. It was literally a genocidal regime. You know, just like you could say, like, as bad as the Nazis were, not every Nazi or not every German who was in the Nazi party was necessarily an evil monster. Some of them were forced to do it. Some of them, felt they didn't have a choice, and they didn't necessarily participate in genocidal things. Although you could say, well, any participation in that machine made them part of the genocidal machine, and that's true. But I mean, I'm just pointing out the fact that these are choices people made. That, many of them did it to survive, to have a more comfortable life for their family, etc. I'm not justifying it in any way. I'm just saying these are the choices people made in World War II in the Nazi Party, and also in places like Syria up until the end of 2024. And the same thing is happening right now in Syria. What do you think? People that are in the HTS, that every single one of them is actually a terrorist? Like the ones who are running, the police members who are walking up and down the streets of Damascus trying to keep the peace? Do you think every single one of them is actually an HTS terrorist? No. A lot of them are just, normal people trying to do a normal job as a police officer. Yes, they do have police officers in Syria, and they're just trying to be, good, productive members of their society. I know it sounds crazy. Like, what are you talking about? It's a war-torn country. It's maybe a war-torn country, but they have an economy as tiny as it may be compared to a lot of countries on Earth. There are plenty of companies in Syria that import and export goods to and from Syria, mostly import, obviously, but they do export some things. And there are people who do regular jobs. They have schools, they have teachers, they have doctors, they have carpenters, electricians, masons, whatever, carpet makers. They got shoe cleaners. I mean, it's a normal country. Except obviously it's not so normal in the sense that they keep choosing terrible people to run it, or they don't choose, but they keep being led by terrible people. And unfortunately, the people of Syria have not yet found the fortitude to take over the country for themselves and not let it be run by terrible monsters. They haven't decided, yeah, we'd like to have it, because, and why? Because it's a country that has been Arabized by colonization of conquering Arab hordes over the centuries. And even the last regime, the Alawites, they held on to power very tenuously by basically oppressing the Sunni and the Shia different factions that they have in Syria. And Alawites themselves are kind of a derivative, cult, if you want to call it that, or religious cult, not like a cult of a tiny number of people. They're significant size. They're a small religion, and they're not like strictly Sunni or something like that, or strictly Shia. They're quite a derivative, just like the Druze are quite a derivative of the Islamic faith, right? And but again, the point is Syria has long been conquered and colonized by Arabs, right? And therefore, it's seen as land that Arabs view as it will forever be theirs. Never mind the fact that there were obviously many civilizations in Syria before the Arabs took over. And many of those civilizations have been completely wiped off the face of the earth, but some still exist. You know, there's obviously the Kurds in northern Syria. There's obviously the Druze in southern Syria, and there are the Alawites, who obviously are not from before the time of the Muslims, but they're not a new group. They've been around for a fairly long time, also relatively, and obviously there's Christians in Syria, right? If you go to Damascus during times like Easter, there's a lot of Christians going to churches and a lot of Christian celebrations. And you'd think, where am I? Like, I thought I was in a Muslim country. You are in a Muslim country if you're in Syria, but like the majority is Muslim, obviously. But there are obviously still a lot of Christians, and they know they can make a lot of revenue from Christian tourists, so they try to keep that door open, despite having a generally terrible reputation the rest of the year. When it's not some major holiday like Christmas or Easter, right? They don't necessarily treat Christians super well, and generally they can get along okay. But this new group now that is running the show is certainly prone to mistreating ethnic minorities, as we've been seeing, and certainly after they're done, which could take a long time, but after they're done fighting against the Kurds and the Druze, there's no telling what they might do. Also to the Alawites, there's no telling what they might do to the Christians, right, that remain in Syria. You don't know. Consider there used to be a Jewish presence in Syria for thousands of years, right? Thousands of years. Now there's basically no one. I think there's like 1 or 2 Jews left in Syria now. And I think actually the last one might have recently died. I'm not even sure. It's like it's very sad. Speaking as somebody who has old historical ties to there, generations and generations ago, not me directly, but multiple generations ago, part of my family lived in Aleppo, Syria, and there's no more Jews in Aleppo, Syria, as far as I know. I don't think there's even one. And I think in all of Syria there are no more Jews, right? And it's a terrible shame. There were Jews there literally for thousands of years, and it was modern, sort of pan-Arabist, Assadist, dictatorship, and there were Alawites that got rid of the Jews. Ultimately, most of them left in the early days of the newly reestablished state of Israel in the late 40s and early 50s. Most of them left Syria, but there were some that remained, and the number just kept dwindling over time as the conditions just kept getting worse and worse for them, because they were subject to an increasing amount of attacks, abuse, oppression. It was getting just basically impossible to live there as a Jew, until eventually they pretty much all left. I think there were like literally two guys that remained, just because that's where they grew up their whole lives, and they didn't feel like they wanted to ever move, no matter what happened to them. They thought they got along well enough with the community to stay there, and I guess they did, because they lived their entire life there. And then eventually, I think they both passed away. I'm not sure, but I mean, whatever the number, even if there is still, it's like in Afghanistan. Also, there were famously like 2 Jewish old men living in Afghanistan for decades, and eventually, like, one passed away, and they hated each other. It's like ironic, but there you go. Like when one died, the other wouldn't even go to his funeral or anything like that because he was just like, no, I don't want to. So it's crazy how people can be. But yeah, like Jews have been ethnically cleansed out of these Arab countries um, for a very long time, increasingly over time. And in the last 77 years, since the reestablishment of the State of Israel, you know, they really suffered a lot. Something most people aren't even aware of when they sit there and cry about oh, the Israelis are doing bad things to the Palestinians, etc. They're ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. No, Israel's not ethnically cleansing Palestinians. Um, Literally, like more than 1 million or so Jews were kicked out of Arab and Muslim countries over the past 77 years, and there are like none left in so many countries, or even in countries where there are still some left. We're talking like hundreds as opposed to hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands that there used to be. There's like maybe a few dozen or a few hundred left, depending on the country. It is really bad. So yeah, that's a little bit of what's happening right now in the Middle East, and tough times for those who want peace and quiet. I'll tell you that. It's tough times. It's a time of conflict, unfortunately. And hopefully the conflicts end sooner rather than later. That'll do it for now. I'll see you guys in the next one. Shalom.